the standards and even like the backwards design model is a form of epistemological oppression on students, in that you are saying that certain ways of knowing and doing an experience and education are the correct ways of doing it. And it is designed by the knower for the unknowing individual, the student. And that is basically a form of oppression. So that being on one end of the continuum of a response, and having that in the back of my mind, I also know, yeah, but you need to create something that kids and teachers can use. So there's that conflict that goes on in my head in the resources that I create. So yeah, that's something that I'm personally kind of struggling with and always thinking through when I create this stuff. Yeah, but how can we make it so that even if you are using an understanding by design approach where it's backwards design and you have these standards and whatnot, is there a way that you can design it that still makes it so that kids can express themselves and be creative with it and are not limited to a narrow scope of understanding within that approach?
That's fascinating. I appreciate you saying that. And I think it speaks to something I've felt. And I was going to add, I spent a lot of my time working on CS Principles in particular, which is a College Board AP course. And so there's a high stakes test at the end. There's like a very robust framework. So high stakes test, they have to submit a project with very specific requirements. But I was involved through the early life of that course, not as something that was in development. That happened for a decade before I showed up. But I was there for like the early implementation of this course actually in the classroom. And I think there is this tension just even in the spirit of that course between this bold vision of what computer science could be with the fact that kind of underlying this gamble that I think the whole CS education community made was scaling out computer science, broadening access. We're going to partner with the College Board. We're going to partner with an AP program. And I think that it speaks to exactly the tension you're talking about. And I think maybe was part of my tension as a curriculum developer was I knew I had to hit these standards. I knew that the teachers that I was supporting really were going to be held to account for them. And maybe the reason that they were able to offer this course at all was because they existed.
Yeah, and that's something that I have the privilege of. The resources I'm designing, I don't have to worry about those high stakes standards. So I can focus on making things interesting rather than making sure, I introduce variables at the correct time or conditionals at the correct time, whatever.
Yeah.
And then one of the other things that has really heavily influenced my own approach is, again, I think that like standards can be a form of oppression when you are forcing everybody to learn only one way of understanding and engaging with computer science. What I tend to prefer is individualized expertise and cultivating that rather than having it so that everybody knows the same thing. So like if computer science constantly talks about jobs, it's all about career and what you can do with it. Okay, well, if a bunch of people are applying for a job and they all have the exact same understanding, who's going to stand out? It's going to be the person who doesn't have that same understanding and can bring something new to the table. They're likely the one who's going to be hired over everybody else who knows the same standards and whatnot. So for me, like if we're going to treat teachers as professionals and have their own expertise and treat the communities that we serve, like the students, as having their own expertise, then we need to cultivate the expertise among kids and adults and make it so that they can express themselves through that. But having like a unified set of standards makes that a little bit more difficult to do. Not impossible, but it at least guides, well, these are the things that we consider to be worth knowing, whereas the things that are not considered standards are things that are unsaid as not being as valuable for understanding. But that's my little standard rant.
And I know we could go deeper on it. And I think it's worth acknowledging that clarifying what we think is important, at least going through the exercise, is valuable. In some ways, I think clarifying what is the field. So the difference between what's in the CSA course and what's in CSP is really different. And there's all these new topics that are being included. And I could make an argument that there is a different vision for what computer science could look like in that course. And so I think that the process of trying to go through that, I will say that that feels like an improvement. I don't know if it's still built on a shaky foundation. I'll give an example. Let's even go beyond standards. Assessment. You can have the standards, and then if only half of them are being assessed, those are secretly the only standards that matter, even within that. So you have a subset of knowledge that is deemed worthy of a standard, and then there's a smaller subset that's actually deemed worthy of assessment. And in a national scale, that will lead to, I think eventually that's where gravity is pulling. And if things aren't pushing away against gravity, then yes, I do really think that there are some undesirable patterns that arise. I'll give a really concrete example. I don't know that I blame anybody for this. I want to be careful. I think there are a lot of people trying very hard in computer science education, but a very concrete example that I think is true. In CS Principles, the way that the framework talked about data, which is a field that, if you remember, I used to be an economist. I had like a data background. The way they talked about data and the way they assessed it felt really different. And then the amount that it showed up on the test was even narrower. The vision for data that was in the standards versus what really actually got taught, or eventually because teachers became wise to this pattern, really, really different. And I think that maybe something that could play out, and we'll have to see, especially because it's such a strange year, but the Explore PT no longer being part of your grade. It is a curricular requirement for CS principals now. But because it is no longer submitted to the College Board and part of your final score, my prediction is we'll see fewer classrooms doing that activity, even if it's in curriculums, even if it's deemed to be important. So this is me kind of going back and forth on your statement, but I'm agreeing with you. I think that like some things are deemed worthy of being in the standards at all. And then if they're not assessed, I think that it's naive to think that teachers will become wise to that. There's a lot of pressures on them.
Right.
Districts will become wise.
Well, and how specific the wording is of the standards. One of the things that we got into a discussion about when I was helping with the Wyoming standards is I wasn't a fan of it was described as represent data visually. Like that was one of the standards from CSTA, something along those lines. And my argument was there are many ways that you can represent data, and it doesn't just have to be visually. So for example, there's sonification where you can represent data through sound. So why do we need to say represent data visually when we can just say represent data through visuals, sound, whatever, and broadening it so that way it wasn't just now a narrow slice of how you can represent something. So that's something that some people might think is thinking a bit too much about it, but the type of wording that you use narrows down the types of engagement. And then, like you're saying with the assessments, if that's not on the assessment, then all right, I don't need to teach it.
My sort of cynical but hopefully half joking answer is if there's not a question about sonic representation of data on the test, Jared, people aren't going to do that.
Right.
Maybe some will. And I think you and I probably would in our own classrooms because we'd say, this is cool. This is interesting, important, or maybe from an accessibility standpoint, because I have seen some really interesting work for blind or visually impaired students. Like how can we use sonification to still allow people to interact with data in a way that they can understand patterns? But yeah, I think there's a very real tendency that if it's not on the test, it slowly may fizzle. As you mentioned, I think that's something I experienced a lot in the land of AP and preparing AP courses.
Yeah, which they have their place and their benefits. Like I benefited from entering college as a sophomore because of the dual enrollment in AP courses that I took. So like that helped me out. It set me up for certain advantages. So I was able to focus on music specific courses and then take other classes outside of my discipline because I had open elective time to do that. And that really benefited me.
This excerpt of the CSK8 podcast is from episode number 61, which is titled Designing Curricula at Scale with GT Wrobel.